Well, this is John Duxbury with these films that were taken with my father's camera in approximately 1928. The car that you saw was Paul Duxbury's car that he stored in the barn they now call the Duxbury. This was a young man by the name of Schmucker. That's all I remember. The stone cottage when the Hedge was there, and the main camp. Well, there is Dick and Margaret Collins. And this, I'm sure, is 1928, because this little Cocker Spaniel's name was Lindy. And there is Pat Collins. And this is Fitz. Fitz was a friend of the Collins boys who came up. And this is Uncle Bill Burnham's Rolls Royce. And this is Tom Collins, the youngest of the Collins boys, playing with Lindy. You don't see that. Well, this was the Fukushima family. Mrs. Fukushima was English, and she had these 4 daughters. Her husband was Japanese, and he never came, to my knowledge. They came from New Rochelle. There's the Tuscarora. I never had the nerve to do that. I forget who dove off the old boathouse. Well, here was the mailboat, the Utawana. Now I see that the Fukushimas are leaving. They left. They never came by motor car. They took the train to Racket Lake and then the boat up the Marion River and up the mailboat. Now these were the waitresses, and the head waitress was Margaret Collins, now Margaret Cunningham. Well, this was on the dock. It must have been Sunday because I see the priest there. And this was Constant Schmucker, who was a friend of my family's. And this was a little rubber inflatable boat that my father bought to go on camping, go on fishing trips to some of the remote lakes. Whoops. I can't recall this family's name. They were from Buffalo, and he published a German paper, German language paper. Now this is Marjorie Bean, and this man, that wasn't her husband Bob, but I forget who his name. But the Beans came for many years and lived in Manhattan. Well, there was a bubble boat. I forgot who owned the bubble boat, but that was the latest thing. That's Marjorie Bean. And that's Betty Hanson. She was our next door neighbor in Scarsdale. The man with a cigarette in his mouth is my father, Paul Duxbury. And this was a fishing expedition. I think this was Uncle Bill Burnham's boat. I think his chauffeur was piloting this, as I recall. Now, Betty Hanson on the left, then Marjorie Bean, and Mrs. Wheeler. The Wheelers came from Albany, and they ran a department store in Albany. Well, that is me diving. The dining room certainly hasn't changed much, has it? And there on the left is Margaret Collins and my mother. And Dick Collins doing his chores, mowing the lawn. And that is Jan Collins. That was Pat's wife. And there was Pat. Well, she worked there as a waitress. And then this may have been before they were married. And of course, Lindy. Dick, I guess, was ticklish. There's Dick Collins and my mother, Phoebe Duxbury. And they're out at the old lean-to. And there on the right is the priest. It must have been Sunday. And Fitz and the priest had a little horseplay. Oh, it's too bad about the priest there. This was one of the little Wheeler boys that came from Albany. And they came with his mother and father and the grandparents. Well, we're going to have a beauty parade now. The lady sitting there on the dock, she wouldn't join in it. That's Tom Collins in the front of the boat with the paddle in his hand. Marjorie Bean and Buddy Hanson. My diving hasn't improved. This is Bob Bean. I don't know where he learned to dance. You know, she didn't want to get in the beauty contest. This is the Wheelers, and the little boys, and the father and the grandfather. Came there for many years, the Hedges. Uncle Bill Burnham. Uncle Bill came up in his baby blue Rolls Royce and chauffeur and stayed in the colonel's room, and the chauffeur stayed in a room right at the bottom of right opposite the ping pong room. I can remember riding in the Rolls Royce over to Indian Lake to get homemade ice cream. And he did make other trips over there for refreshment. Of course, that was during Prohibition. This was Maurice Callahan, Mrs. Collins' brother. He was the one that piloted the Tuscarora, and they owned the Callahan store, which was right where the grocery store is today. The bridge, I think, has been restored. Now, this was the channel between Blue Mountain Lake and Eagle Lake. In those days, there were many canoe trips. This is one of the beautiful old speedboats that came from the Eagle's Nest Club. And this was a sea sled, which was meant for very rough water, not Blue Mountain Lake. And this was owned, I think, by the Klein family, who were part of the Eagle's Nest group. Well, here comes the Unawana through the channel. And they had a drawbridge in those days. And here we're opening the drawbridge in the Udawana. Of course, there was no pollution in those days. Heine was the pilot of this boat. I know Heine blew the whistle, and this was a hacker craft, one of the beautiful mahogany speedboats that belonged to the Eagle's Nest group. The Tuscarora was always piloted twice a week. Now, that's my father, Paul Duxbury, on the left, and Uncle Bill Burnham. And now my father's kissing Mrs. Collins goodbye. And then he's going to have a little wrestling match with Dick Collins. That's Uncle Bill Burnham on the right. Uncle Bill's giving my mother a little kiss, and then we were off. Uncle Bill Burnham came from Bridgeport. His family owned the Bridgeport Brass Company. Now that's Tom Collins down by front of Callahan's store. And this was Blue Mountain Lake in those days, and there was Fuller's Garage. One of the great thrills in my life was in that pilot house. Then I went in there to talk to Mr. Callahan. And coming up through Eagle Lake, he said, "Jack, wouldn't you like to steer?" Well, he let me steer the boat and then walked out of the pilot house and left me all alone. I'll never forget that. That's me with my little boat rented from the boatyard. That are a couple of the waitresses on the dock. Certainly hasn't changed much. I remember this man brought this boat up on a trailer. I can't remember his name, but it was the old Glopat. Well, here's the boat. Betty Hanson's giving me and Lindy a ride. This was Tom Hanson, Betty Hanson's father, our next door neighbor in Scarsdale, New York. And this is at Terrell Pond, directly back of Blue Mountain. My father they used to hike in there to go because of the good trout fishing. I remember Mr. Hanson was not an old-time trout fisherman, but here my father was. Of course, he didn't wear any pants. He used to fish in his underwear. Well, I guess Mr. Hanson He got a nice trout. My diving is improved. Well, that's Uncle Bill Burnham, and that's his boat, the Hattie 5. And I think, as I recall, it was named for his late wife. Some of his friends, they were taking him for a ride. Tom piloting it. That's Dick Collins, senior and junior. Well, now this, now that is Thatch, as I recall, that's Thatcher's Island, and that's Crane's Point. I don't know if that was the house that burned or not, the one that was rebuilt. Now this is on the north shore of the lake. That is the Blue Mountain House right up on the top of your picture, where the museum is today. Now this is on the west side of the lake. There's the Blue Mountain House. You can see it up there. Now this was Walbridge's Island, which was back at Thatcher's Island, which was later bought by Lucretia Barry, the opera singer. There's the Blue Mountain House up there again. Now this is over in the west, like over by Hemlock Hall.